Yeah, you said all of this. So, I guess the main thing is, oh well, first of all, sign up Queer Code London. We're always looking for speakers, so it's a meetup for queer people. It's kind of just like this, it's just technical talks. So if you know anybody or you'd like to speak, let me know. But this, I think, is the main thing. I care a lot about quality of code, and TDD is my jam. I'm a bit of a fanatic about TDD. And I'm going to tell you, I guess, a story about the book that I wrote, how I got to that point and the problems I suffered, I suppose. So a couple of years ago, I gave a talk here about testing React from first principles and my approach to testing. And I gave that talk in a few different places. And from that, Pact approached me and asked me to write a book about it. So that's kind of how that came about. It was from literally speaking at meetups out there. So if you want to write a book, then speaking at meetups is the way to go. Not going to say anything bad about Pact as a publisher. They're amazing. But one of the, I'm going to talk about the challenges that I came across as I went through this process. And I started writing it in August last year, and I published last month. So, story about hooks. I guess half of you are familiar with this. So 16.8 introduced hooks. When was that? February, March. And this talks about a use effect hook. But there's a whole bunch of different hooks, and they are not straightforward. Once you get to understand them and you've worked with them, they're pretty simple. You can introduce them into your workflow very easily, but actually to teach somebody hooks is really difficult. There's a lot of knowledge you need to learn before you can even begin to use them. With the use effect hook, so the use effect hook is the one that you use if you want to run side effects in your component. So that's like fetching data. This is the main one that I would use it for. If you want to do that, then and you're writing tests, then you're going to get warnings in your test runner. So Jest is going to produce a bunch of warnings. Has anybody seen these warnings about using the act function? Does anybody test hooks? Oh, great. So this is why. So I'm going to come back to this. It's really immature. Support for testing hooks is not really there at the moment. It's fine. You can do it. You can completely do it, but it's just not the React team's focus. So you want to get a bunch of warnings, and if you care about the quality of your tests and you want your tests to be, beautifully green all the time, well, that's not possible in 16.8. React likes what I call guardrail-driven development. So they will, you'll get a lot of warnings in your console or in your tests when you do things that React don't want you to do or think you shouldn't do. So it's a little bit judgmental, but I guess in a way that's pretty good. And in 16.8, this new act function was introduced. And so if you don't use act, they're going to tell you that you don't use it and that you should be using it. Actually, what it does is something that we've been able to do forever in testing React, which is flushing the task queue. I'll look at some code that shows that. There's two forms of act. There's the synchronous form and the asynchronous form. You need 16.9 if you want to use the asynchronous form. 16.9 is alpha only. And yeah, like I say, once you start using the 16.9, you'll be able to get rid of those warnings that your tests show. Okay, so I'm sure you can't see this. Can you see this at the back? You need this now. So this is component mount. This is a form of component mount for the sample component. If you are interested in seeing this code, it's the same code sample the whole way through the slides. So just have a look at the slides afterwards. But I've essentially got a class component. I'm not interested in what it renders actually for this talk. But I have this component mount method, and inside of that, I'm doing a window.fetch. I'm awaiting the result. So there's a promise involved here. And when the result comes back, I call set state, and I set my component state based on what came back. Is that kind of a familiar pattern to people? Yeah. So the hooks version is very similar. And often when you kind of squint at hooks, they look the same as classes. So use effect can kind of take the place of component mount. The code is kind of similar. If you've used the hooks plugin for ESLint, you'll know that if you get the use effect hook wrong in your component, it's going to tell you all the ways you're going wrong. Right? So use effect is really easy to screw up. There's so many little things you need to know about use effect. So the second argument is a list of props that, when they change your hook, your use effect hook will kind of tear down and then run again. People familiar with use effect and how that works? So unlike component mount, it's not just going to run when your component mounts. It's going to run every time one of these props changes. So you've got to be careful about what props you use in here, and that they're carefully they're in this array if you use them. And there's all sorts of complexities. But the main thing is the window fetch call is still here. Rather than calling setState, I've got a state variable, so useState. Last time I gave this talk, I said, oh yeah, useState is the easiest hook. And then I got into explaining useState, and it's not simple at all. It's really not simple. I don't want to get into it. But essentially, we call this setter here. So I've got the window fetch call, and when the result comes back, I set the state that I need to render. So how do we test that? Well, so we're going to use a spy to spy on window fetch. So a little bit of a recap on the spies and how we use them. If you are going to use a spy, you always need these two tests. You need one test which says I'm calling the spy with the right arguments, and the second test says I do the right thing with the result. And maybe you need more tests. I'm actually only going to talk about the first test in this talk. So to spy on it, you might have seen all this stuff before. I'm using, oh, yeah. Oh, there's a mistake here. Oh no. Shouldn't have that semicolon. Yeah, if you don't like semicolons, I'm very sorry. I guess, so one interesting thing about the way I write code is I don't use Enzyme, and I don't use React testing library. I do everything from first principles. I don't really believe in these libraries. I don't think they give you much value. That wasn't always the case. So when I started writing the book back in August last year, it was about class components, and I was using Enzyme. And about halfway through, so November time, I'd written about half the book by that stage. The React team announced hooks, and my technical reviewer was furious. He thought it was the worst thing ever. As a lot of people react that way when they see hooks. It's not the greatest thing. If you're all about classes, then hooks just looks horrible. So my technical reviewer hated it. I wasn't really sure how to feel, but I went to my editor and I said, well, look, React had just announced this hooks thing, and they've decided that class components are no longer the way we should write software. So I was thinking maybe I should write a couple of chapters about hooks. And my editor came back to me and said, well, how about you rewrite the entire book using hooks? And that was a bit of a shock, because I can understand that. Like, they don't want to produce a book that is out of date before it's even printed, right? But I like to think of it as the 5 stages of grief. So you kind of go from denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And I had to get through those 5 stages pretty quick, because it wasn't really my book; it's the publisher's book. I'm just the author, right? But my technical reviewer, I'm sure he's still stuck in anger days, still to this day. But yeah, so I had to go back and rewrite half the book. And while I was doing that, I realized that there was no support for hooks in Enzyme. And React testing library, I guess they wanted there to be support, but they didn't really know how to do it, and they were still in the process of figuring that out. And the attitude I felt from the enzyme team, not that I was involved with it at all, was just one of, we don't care about hooks. And I got that because all of the programmers I worked with had the same kind of, I don't care. You know, it's a very hard thing to stomach. So I then decided, right, that's it. I'm just going to remove enzyme from the book entirely. And so I actually just wrote a few helper functions from scratch. This is a great opportunity to write a Jest environment as well. Jest is a great tool, and it's very easy to just roll your own. So you can get a glimpse of that from the slides. So Jest has great support for spies. So you can just say jest.spy on window fetch. And if you want to mock return values, that's quite simple to do as well. If you're interested in how to mock the fetch is actually a complicated API. But you can do it with a few little helper functions like this. So if you're curious about how to mock it, just take a look at the slides. So pre-hooks, to test the fetch call, here's the test here. You would just kind of, so this line is react.render, so you just render into your container. And then that's it. You just have your expectation. So before, in component did mount, that was always called as part of the render call. So if all I want to do is test the arguments that I've passed to that window.fetch, I can do that without having to wait for any tasks to run on the task queue. Because component did mount will run as soon as I mount the component. That is not the case with hooks. So when you use useEffect does not run in that same task. So if you try to just run that test as it is, it will fail. The mock wasn't called. So one solution is to use layout effect hook, which is kind of more like component did mount in that it will run in the same cycle. But actually, what I would prefer to do is use useEffect, and instead, first of all, make the test async, and then secondly, have this line await you promise set timer. So probably don't have enough time to go into this, but you might be familiar. Has anybody seen this kind of thing before? This is flushing the task queue. Some this you see called flush promises. It basically says wait for everything in the task queue to complete. And you kind of need it if you're running if you've got any promises. So if you've got a window.fetch call, and you want to make sure that it is actually called, and you can do something with the data, then you need this line. So you need this with hooks. You also need this to test the result of the promise. So if you're going to wait for the promise to return, then you need to make sure you wait. So essentially when you have that line there, it says, okay, everything else that comes after it runs once the task queue has been flushed. So that was pre-hooks. But guardrails. So in 16.8, the guardrails get in your way. They're going to tell you, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't have updates to your component without having them in this act function, this mysterious act function. And I guess this is the first place that a lot of people will know about act, because their test runner will give them this warning. Okay, so let's do that. So you import it from React test utils, and then in place of that await new promise set timer, that one line, you wrap your render code inside this act function. And I'll explain what that does in detail later. Okay, so at this point the test will pass, but it doesn't fix the warning. The warning remains. You need to use the alpha version of 16.9 to fix that warning. And that introduces this async version of act. So it's the same, except you need to mark your lamp, the first expression with async, and put the keyword in front of act. So same thing other than that, and this time it passes. So this is basically saying wait for the task queue to flush in the same way that our existing code did. So previously we had a version that worked. They broke it in 16.8, so we couldn't do that without warnings. In 16.9, it's fixed. This is kind of more readable, I think. It's more explicit about what's going on, although act is a bit of a nothing word. It doesn't really say anything. But if you know what act does, and if you've read the documentation, which I'm not sure the documentation exists at the moment, but you know, it's kind of explicit, whereas the previous line, await new prompt set timeout, is just a bit cryptic. Okay, but if I go back, so this sync version, so the synchronous version exists in 16.8. Why is that useful at all? If it wasn't until 16.9 that version came along that helped me. Okay, so act is actually useful in this scenario. So there's a person on the React team who's working on the act function has a repo which goes through a bunch of different examples. And this example is one I've just adapted from that. And there's a call to set counter here, so there's some state called counter, and there's a set counter here. And the thing about this is that it's using the version of set counter where you give it a value. So there's another form of set counter. There's another form of a setter called the updater version, which takes a function, and React will run that, I guess, atomically. It will give you the current value, and so that you're kind of guaranteed that it runs with some kind of correctness about what value counter is. It's a very kind of edge case. In my opinion, it's a very edge case scenario. But after a while, you know not to use this form of setters. You get a feel for when it's formed wrong. And in the book, the second half of the book is about a graphical application, and I use the use effects hook with a request animation frame, and it's very important that you use this other form, otherwise the whole application breaks. So in this case, there is an important case. So for sync, if you run it in act, test code that would have worked before no longer works. And the reason this can highlight this test error is because act will batch up your calls to any state setters and run them all at the end. So set counter doesn't actually, so there's basically a loop here which calls set counter multiple times. And if you run this without act, you'll get a different version of counter each time, but there's a kind of race condition in here. And if you run it with act, it will batch them all up. So where you expect this set counter to increment the value by 1 each time, and you end up with a value of 3. When you run it with act, you get a value of 1. And that's highlighting the race condition. So that's the whole point of act synchronous version. It batches up your setter calls and runs them all at the very end of the act function. It's not the most useful thing. So then the asynchronous version builds on that. But the more useful thing about the asynchronous version is that it will also wait for the task queue to flush. I'd kind of like to talk about this code in more detail, but you're so far back, it's not. I don't know. You can look at you can study the slides when you go and tweet me questions. So there was one really interesting case in the book that I didn't know how to solve, and I had to ask the React team for help with this. And that's I had this test where I had this behavior of the app where you could click the button to submit a form, and while the form was submitting, there would be an indicator that showed that your data was being sent. So when the button was clicked, I call set submitting to true to set the state that says okay, we're submitting, and then when the fetch call returns, I set it false. And when the setter happens, the component re-renders, and so the user can see a little spinner to see that the form is submitted. But how do you test this? So in the previous world, pre-hook, world, pre-act world, so there's kind of 3 tests you want here. The first test says that when you submit the form, a submitting indicator should be shown. So that's kind of the first test. And you can test that by not waiting for the task queue to flush. So your handler will have been called. Your fetch function will have run and be placed on the queue, but won't have run. So then you can say, right, at this moment the task is still running, and I expect the indicator to be shown. And the second task is initially I don't want the indicator to be shown. So for that one, again, you don't need to do any nonsense with the task queue. You just don't need, well, I'll show you the code for that. And then the third case is when the task is finished running and you want the indicator to be false again. So in that case, you need to wait for the task queue. Previously, you would have said await new promise set timeout. And you can do the same thing with async act, right? So you can just wrap your code in async act, and you'll be able to test what happens once the task is completed. But how do we get the first test? The first test being what happens when the fetch call has been pushed to the task queue but not run. And I couldn't figure out a way for that to work without this warning presenting itself. So if I didn't use act, I was going to get a warning from React. If I use the synchronous form of act, I would still get the warning from React, because it knows that I've pushed something to the task queue, but I haven't waited for it. And if I use if I use the asynchronous form of act, it's going to run my task, which is my last test. So I was kind of in this bind. So the trick is actually you need 2 acts, and this is where I think the API at the moment could maybe do with some work, or is a little bit complicated. The first call is just the synchronous act, which tells it to run use effect hook. So there's kind of 2 things in this synchronous form of act. It's batching up the state calls, but also it has to run the use effect hook, like you would have just had for free with component in map. And then I'm doing this weird thing where I wrap my expectations and await the async version of act. So this does nothing really. There's no code that exercises React here, but it tricks React into thinking that you have done what it wants. So this is a hack, and this is what the Facebook team recommends at the moment. And I hope they don't fix it, because then my book is wrong. But yeah, this is kind of what you have to do. For me, this is the trickiest thing in the whole of the React ecosystem. Right? Testing is usually fine. It's very easy. But this is not fun. And then the other 2 tests become a bit boring. So initially, it does not display the submitting indicator. Yeah, you just render and don't run use effect. And then hides the indicator when form is submitted. You just wrap your submit call in the async form as normal. So they're actually the simpler tests. And I think that's kind of it. Yeah, so I just wanted to recap. So this is like a deep dive into this new act function. It's all here at these slides. It is complicated. The documentation isn't quite there yet. The React team are working hard on other features. I feel like testing isn't the biggest priority for them. But those of us who care about testing are still finding ways to do it. If you want to try this out, you need the alpha version, which has been around for a couple of months now. Yeah, I mentioned this a couple of times. So sync act batches up your state mutations. You can just, there's probably like I said, with experience, you kind of just start to use the updated version. Yeah, I don't know how useful it is. I haven't found it that useful. It was not going to tell you when you don't use act. It's not going to warn you every time you don't use act. It only warns you when you don't use act for asynchronous calls. So my point at the start, libraries like Enzyme, I'm not even sure, I don't even think Enzyme supports act at the moment, like months later. What these libraries will be able to do for you is hide act entirely. So if you don't want to care, if you don't want to know about this stuff, these libraries are the way to go, because I think they'll find a way to mask it and pretend that it doesn't exist. I quite like the explicitness, because it really makes you reason carefully about what your test is doing and what you want to test. Whereas I think what these libraries will end up doing is having this kind of blanket, everything is in this async act block, just assuming that you're always going to want to flush the task queue, which is, as you've seen with that example with submitting indicator, not what you would want all the time. So yeah, don't be afraid of rolling your own. It's actually really straightforward. I agree with your point about like jest environments. Jest environments are great. Don't be afraid to just write your own code, write your own environments. Yeah, so finally just some tips on writing better tests. Short tests. The number one mistake I see React developers in particular making is just having a bunch of really long tests. I tried to make these slides not about TDD, but just about testing in general. You don't need to be doing TDD to write short tests. Short tests are just good, in all forms of testing. Like unit tests should be small, independent units. Test dependencies with spies, and if you're doing that, you probably want two tests. One to test the arguments to your functions, and one to test the results. So I didn't show you those results, using those results. But if I did, so I had a fetch call, and I'd probably want to check that the component rendered with the data that was returned, something like that. Use the arrange act assert form for your test. So all of your tests should always be in that order. There's 3 phases of each test. There's the arrange where you set up any dependencies. There's act where you actually perform an action. And then there's assert where you have your expectations and check that your unit of the test is in the right state. Jest has a bunch of expectations which are probably harmful and mean you can get things the wrong way around. To name one, has assertions. Like if you have has assertions in your test, it's probably an indicator that your tests can be refactored. If I saw that in the code base, I would think, right, how can I fix this? Yeah, finally, if your tests are hard to write, you can simplify your production code. That's a smell that your production code isn't in its simplest form. And that happens all the time. So everybody who follows TDD is aiming to have simple tests. If I go back to, this is 2 tests. These are normal tests for me to write, like 2 lines and 5 lines of code. Anything more than 7 lines of code in a test is probably, that's. It's not that I would always fix it, and it's not that I don't get myself into those situations, but if I do get myself into that situation, I probably know at the back of my mind that there's a problem with my design, or that I can split apart stuff. So it's just a kind of good indicator that there's something you can work on. And I think, if I think about the clients that I work with, a lot of the time we're rushing, and we don't give ourselves the time to go back and fix the code in the way we want. But then that comes back to bite you later on, because your tests just get more and more complicated. And that's when we stop testing, or we start producing fewer tests, because we know how difficult they can be, and they become such a drag. So it's very important that we're always aiming for the simplest test. Want to learn more? Oh, I have a copy. Never bring this. So the best book you read ever. 496 pages of sheer goodness. Is all about first principles. So it's kind of a fun read. And I'm massively dogmatic in the way I write code. I have my own approach. I would expect if you read this, you probably disagree with a whole bunch of stuff, but hopefully you would learn something, or at least have something to help you question your own beliefs and your own dogma. Yeah, and like I said, it tests animation and stuff as well, so it's kind of fun. It's more interesting in this stuff. Yeah, thanks. And slides are already online on Twitter, so please get in contact, and any questions, let me know.